Hi everyone, and welcome to the video podcast with myself, Ian Thornton Trump. We're doing this for Security Magazine with our sponsor, Cijax. And right next to me is Lisa Forte and Phil. How are you doing?
Yeah, not so bad, not so bad.
It's exciting to be back in our pub, so we're just going to warn everyone that anything can happen. But on this video podcast today, we're going to talk about things that are happening. This is the high-speed money laundering video podcast. Now, the reason we're doing this has a lot to do with Lisa, and she brought this topic to the table. So tell us a little about why we're going to talk about this exciting topic.
The way he introed that made it sound like you were implying that due to my money laundering background.
No, we promised that we wouldn't bring out your money laundering background. The audience don't need to know that.
And to be fair, the statute of limitations is long expired.
What do you mean? I'm quite young, actually. Yes. So I was very kindly sent a copy of this book, which is Jeff White's new book, Rinsed. Some of you will have read his Lazarus Heist one, which was, I thought, fantastic.
Yep.
He is probably one of the greatest writers, I think, in this industry. Anyway, so his book, Rinsed, is all about money laundering, and it talks about money laundering really across the spectrum of criminality. You know, obviously in cyber we think about ransomware groups. Most normal non-cyber people will think about drug money laundering, things like that, which obviously plays a part, but actually it underpins basically every layer of criminality, because ultimately if you're making money from crime, which most people are, because otherwise you'd come under more of a terrorist or an activist, politically driven, you're probably financially driven, right? And so therefore, if you're making and generating illicit funds, you need a way to clean that money, because otherwise you cannot use it. And I think that not only applies to sort of taking it further from this book, it also applies to things that we're seeing now. For example, like countries that have been heavily sanctioned. You know, how do they obtain money and get around those sanctions? And again, that comes back into this. So this is why it's a really important topic. And if you haven't already gone and done so, go and buy the book.
And again, I was just going to add on that, the links between criminality, organised criminality, and terrorism they're so closely linked in everything that's going on. So you find that counter-terrorism forces around the world, the crowd that they put out is follow the money.
Absolutely.
And as they're following the money, that then ties in with the organised crime gangs, because terrorism has to be financed somehow and the funds have to be moved around. It uses exactly the same networks. So actually, we're talking about both here together.
We're gonna kick it off, and we're gonna go geopolitical. We're gonna go around the world and talk about a lot about the countries. It's interesting because you made reference to the book, and his first book was Lazarus Heist, and there is probably no other nation that has been so craftily designing money laundering schemes than North Korea. Mm-hmm. North Korea has been under sanctions since pretty much the beginning of North Korean time. Clearly, though, the thing that has created the high-speed money laundering has been cryptocurrency and has been the ability to move massive amounts of funds really quickly. Before we got into this, we kind of had a round table, as we usually do, the huddle before it. Lisa, you picked out some really interesting examples of some current sort of money laundering operations that the clear light of day shined into. Do you want to tell us about those?
So I think the first thing to start off with is that there's sort of three key stages to money laundering that you have to understand. The first one is what they call placement, which is basically where you move the funds from the illegal activity or the activity you're trying to hide, and you try to sever that connection, right? That's often the time when you get caught, because in traditional financial systems that involves depositing cash into bank accounts, which is high risk.
Yeah.
That's where questions are going to get asked. Same in crypto. Exchanges are likely to start asking questions that relate to KYC, KYT, and again, that's where you're most likely to get caught. The second stage is layering. And this is basically where you're now going to try and obfuscate where that money has come from. So you, in the crypto space, you do that through mixers, you do that through other sort of mechanisms.
Like Tornado Cash, which just was taken down recently?
100%. Yeah. And in the traditional finance system, they use mules, they use small accounts, you're mixing it up in that kind of way and trying to obfuscate where anything has come from at any particular time. The final stage is integration, and this is where the criminal can actually extract and use that money. Because ultimately, if you've got the money dispersed, say, across all these accounts, it ultimately needs to come together here so that you can then actually go and use it to buy your Ferrari. Otherwise, it's all for nothing, right? We're not just doing it for fun. So that's essentially how the 3 stages of money laundering kind of work. And obviously, money laundering has been a problem since we've had money. I would probably.
Yeah, it's been there for sure. The old
not
way
new.
was we take the gold coins, we melt the gold coins down to create gold bars, and then we say, "Here's the gold bars that I found."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Phil, the UK obviously, is known as a financial center.
Yeah.
There was a recent piece of legislation which I thought about was a real blow to money launderers, and that was the unexplainable wealth legislation.
Unexplainable wealth orders. So what the National Crime Agency has got the ability to do when it's investigating and it's looking at people's bank accounts, looking at what's in there, if they come across sums or transactions that are not logical, they cannot easily explain them. What they can then do is get the judge to put a freezing order against that account and start proceedings to seize that money under an unexplained wealth order. So this is how they're taking down an awful lot of the organised crime organisations and organised crime and terror organisations, because they are getting the funds that they've raised through illegitimate means and trying to, as Lisa has explained, legitimise them. And those unexplained wealth orders can result in the seizure of houses, the seizure of yachts, the seizure of aircraft, the seizure of cars, the seizure of land, or the seizure of cash in bank accounts. And then the onus is on the individual whose bank account it is or whose asset it is to prove and provide a paper trail to the court as to where that money's come from. And often they can't.
Yeah, and I was going to go back to that because a big situation where a bunch of funds were illicitly moved from an African bank via the spouse, that was the famous case here in the first test case of that particular legislation that I'm aware of, where the $5 million or something like that spent over 2 years at Harrods was like, where did you get the money to do this? And it turns out it was illicit funds. I want to go to layer 1, though, of your 3 steps to successful money laundering, because we observed some big disclosures from some of the shady law firms that were involved in this. I believe it was the Panama Papers as well as the Pandora Papers. Pandora's interesting because that was the one where organized crime strike back, and I think it was in Malta or Cyprus where the journalist that uncovered that was then killed. So let's talk a little bit about the part where you have to set up the organizations for the successful money laundering.
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing about the Pandora Papers, from my perspective, was the sheer, I guess, size of the reach almost globally. I mean, there almost wasn't a political or public figure who wasn't involved in it in some capacity, right? It was kind of like the thing that pulled them all together in like a nice little club or whatever you want to call it. And I think what was interesting was, because I think in the Pandora Papers you had presidents of Ukraine, you had Ecuadorian presidents, you had Tony Blair, you had, I forget his name, Vladimir Putin's propaganda minister, who wasn't a propaganda minister but also was very much a propaganda minister, him. And I think they worked out that basically the breach, the leak, came from several offshore firms. And essentially what these firms would do would be to set up shell companies predominantly in the British Virgin Islands. I think 2/3 of the companies were all British Virgin Islands set up. And essentially they'd run trusts and things like this, and they'd basically manage to obfuscate what you owned. And this was done, I suppose it did have a money laundering link in some cases, but it was done mainly to kind of evade tax liability more than it was anything else. But the principle is essentially the same. You're trying to disassociate yourself from the assets and the money in order to benefit financially, right? So it's sort of the same, I guess. I was talking about this with one of my friends, and they described it as adventurous accounting.
Adventurous accounting, yeah, with flexible ethical.
Flexible ethics, yes.
But we have to remember that money laundering itself is a business. It's all about making money from money. And therefore, trying to turn something that will raise red flags into something that people will not raise any red flags about, but that costs. And therefore, that's why we're seeing all of these shell companies and the different accountants getting involved at different levels. Some of them will have to understand that there's questions behind this money and turn a blind eye. Others who could be involved are further down the chain, and everything that's going through has got a legitimacy, because whenever you go through your KYC, it's relatively easy to work out what the layers of questions are, and you just have to then make sure that when you get into that organisation for those layers of questions, that all the dodgy stuff is done before that. When you get into there, and as soon as you start to get into more legitimate accounts and where you can put it in, all of a sudden it's easier to move the money around and produce that trail. And it's not just getting it into a legitimate account and then you've got it, it's then legitimate account moving it around so that you can produce a trail of where the money's gone, shown over a period of time, that it's got extra legitimacy to it.
I think also, in this day and age, we've made it harder to accurately do KYC.
Oh, definitely.
I went through this with a law firm recently for myself, and they had a KYC platform that I had to use to validate I was who I said I was. And as I was going through the platform, I was thinking, I'm not very technically savvy, and I'm definitely not an AI specialist or a deepfake specialist. But I could quite easily bypass this with very little Googling, and successfully pass it off. And essentially, what it amounted to really was a PDF of a bank statement with my address on it, a screenshot on my phone of my passport page, and then a video which was like 2 or 3 seconds long where you didn't have to say anything, I didn't have to say anything specific, I literally just looked and turned my head this way and turned my head this way, and that was it.
That's for the biometrics part.
That's for the biometrics part.
Theoretically. Yeah.
Well, I don't know, but I was thinking, like, that's not that difficult to fake.
No.
At all.
Yeah. Especially with the tech that you can get online right now.
Yeah. And I very much doubt that app was looking at the metadata of the photograph that I uploaded from my phone.
Not, no.
Almost certainly not.
No, because you'll have turned the
metadata off.
Yeah, exactly. But interestingly enough, suspicion is the next piece of this. So there are some red lines, and we've talked about some of the stuff that Jeff talked about in the book, like human trafficking and drugs. But you said something that really shocked me, and just correct me if I'm wrong here. You said that if you moved a ton of cocaine, you could be in jail for the rest of your life. But if you move $500 million illicitly, it's what, a 6-8-year sentence, maybe?
Yeah, so this came from, which brings me on to a really good point, actually. Almost the home, I suppose, of organised crime, Italy.
And Italians get involved in organised crime?
Pioneering.
Never.
Pioneering.
As a result, from the perspective of financial crime investigations, the Italians are probably the best in the world. Very close to
Long
it.
history.
Long history of sniffing that sort of stuff out. But a mafia boss was quoted saying, if I move this amount of cocaine, I'll get 20 years if I'm caught, and I'm more likely to get caught. But I can basically launder 500 million euros, and even if I get caught, which is unlikely, I'll get 6 years. So the cost-benefit analysis is very much skewed in one direction. And what we've seen with the Italian mafia, so in Italy, for people who don't know, people use the phrase Italian mafia, but it's not really very accurate. There's lots of different mafia groups that run in different areas. The 'Ndrangheta, who are based in Calabria, which is the bottom part of the boot, if you look at Italy, they are incredibly wealthy and incredibly powerful, probably the most of all of the mafia groups. And they very much turned their hand to money laundering and fraud. And famously, actually, in Napoli, in Naples, the Camorra, or the other mafia group, and they were talking about money laundering, because obviously it takes many forms, and they were talking about how they've really been integral in making the streets of Naples safe again. Because it's really bad for their illicit businesses if the streets are really bad.
Well, yeah.
But again, this is a really important factor that's in there, because whenever you get the big groups like that in different countries, actually what they're enabling are little people to open up their own businesses, and they're helping to finance the opening up of those businesses, and it's employing people in the community, and it's building communities, and it's enabling a greater wealth within the communities, and helping things from a community cohesiveness perspective, because those businesses then, the individuals don't really care that they're being used to launder money. They know that they've got a business, they've got a job, they're making enough money to feed their families, and that's all that they're interested in. And this is where it's then very difficult to break up the organised crime gangs that are doing it, because you're going to affect so many people further down the chain with all these.
And they have great
businesses.
PR, right? Yeah. Because they're in there, and this is...
It's community service. It's not illegal. It's looking after the community.
And this is sort of like, again, in the North American perspective, role was fulfilled by the outlaw motorcycle gang. Now, they probably would choose to maybe not have the outlaw part, and just call themselves motorcycle gangs, but they're active in community support and things like that, and raising funds and having a bake sale, So it's interesting to me that there are sort of like some of these money laundering organizations that we kind of accept their role in society. But I want to talk about the unacceptable, which is if you have and been endorsed for terrorist financing, you get a target on your back. And in the war on terror and in the recent fisticuffs between Israel and Hamas, terrorist financing of insurgencies in all of its different forms has been a part of the nation state's decision to enact foreign policy via these illicit channels. Mm-hmm. And so, from your perspective, and maybe drawing on some of your experience and background, how serious is the threat of the money in terms of like the ability to sustain the insurgency?
It's critical, and that's why counter-terror organisations will follow the money in what's going on. It underpins everything that happens, and this is why you find that a lot of the terrorist organisations base themselves not just ideologically in the countries that they're in, but also from a financial perspective, because a lot of the countries where they're working in, you've got cash-based societies, you've got international aid agencies coming in, backed by governments, where everything is cash-based, so it's moving cash around. For example, Iraq, when I was there, the legitimate individuals in certain areas were sending illegitimate shipments out into other Arab countries with suitcases of cash every week into the Islamic banking system that's there. That money was then being stored to be used partially to continue with insurgents because they were linked to the insurgents. But where were they getting the money from? A lot of them were getting it from international organisations or the international governments that were there trying to stop the insurgencies, who were buying everything from a construction perspective with cash, who were buying local goods and services with cash. My office in Iraq, when it was there, was 2 doors down from an office that had 2 heavily armed soldiers in it, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It had a big metal cage in the centre of it, and there was a minimum of $5 million in cash in there at all times. And once the cash went out, it did things. So the disruption that there is internationally across the world is being exploited by the criminal gangs, by the money launderers, as much as it is helping those individuals who are trying to stop the wars that are going on around the world. So there's a dilemma there.
Do you have access to that current location of where? Anyway, sorry.
He airdropped it to you.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, and the code is such and such.
I want to talk a little bit about now some of the more interesting claims about Bitcoin, the Bitcoin ledger, and what can be traced and what can't be traced. So you've done some research into some of these organizations, like that recent takedown of Tornado Cash that I previously mentioned, but also some other interesting techniques in terms of mixing and stuff. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to note is that cryptocurrency potentially facilitates money laundering at scale, but that's not at all to say that a large quantity of money laundering does not still happen through the traditional financial system, because it does. Through property, through all sorts of other things, moving money, like you said, in suitcases of cash, it's still a problem. So this is by no means pinning it all on cryptocurrency. However, Bitcoin into and of itself actually solves a lot of this problem, because it's a ledger that shows accurate transactions between me to Phil and then Phil to you and so on and so forth, right? Everyone can see it's publicly visible. So on the face of it, that solves that problem. However, what ended up happening was that they would set up mixing services that would either be run kind of like an organization, or they'd be smart contracts, which are basically a code that says if X happens, do Y, kind of essentially. And Tornado Cash was the latter. It was a smart contract mixer, a smart contract mixer. And these mixers basically just mix legitimate funds, illegitimate funds all together, paired out in sort of predetermined but secret denominations to a bunch of people, and then essentially break that chain between it came from Phil to now it's suddenly in Ian's hands. No one knows what happened, right? So that kind of happens on the sort of Bitcoin and Ethereum blockchains. But then you have a kind of further complicating element to crypto, which are privacy coins, which have privacy, shall we call it, built in at protocol level, as opposed to using these mixes. And so they use things like stealth addresses, ring signatures, things like that, to kind of obfuscate where things are going, so you can't really audit.
Would that be like Monero and that
Yeah.
Okay.
So they do it in that manner to provide privacy. And so I guess here is the problem. On some level, privacy is great, right? We're all in cybersecurity. We believe in privacy, we believe in encryption, we believe in all of that.
Yeah.
The problem with privacy is it does facilitate criminality.
Yeah.
Because inevitably, if everything's transparent, it's harder for the criminals, but it's also worse for us. And we've got into this kind of really awful...
It's hypocritical, because it's like, if I'm a victim of a crime, I want CSI, I want all the CCTV camera, I want it all. I want, privacy for bad guys doesn't exist,
100%.
right? But if I'm not a victim of any crime, I want to not be subject to the
100%.
scrutiny, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this is part of the problem, because privacy coins, for example, are brilliant for people who are maybe activists, human rights activists in countries who need to move money but don't want the country to see it. Absolutely invaluable for them. But unfortunately, what you can't do is go, are you a human rights activist? Yes, you can have access to that blockchain. You're a terrorist. No, you can't.
Right.
And there is the big problem that we've ended up with. And I think it's almost a tragedy, actually, because I very much believe in privacy, but I similarly don't believe in terrorist financing.
Yeah.
So where does that leave you?
And this is where there's a number of things that come out with this. The UK, London, is one of the leading capitals for money laundering that's going on because of the finance that's going through.
Leading, you could argue.
Well, yes.
Leading, yeah.
But still, when you look at the split, and I can't remember where I read this, so it may be slightly out, but it's indicative between what's happening in the crypto world and what's happening in the fiat world with normal cash. For every dollar that is fraudulently transacted in crypto, there's still $8 fraudulently transacted in fiat currency. So hard cash is still king when it comes to the money laundering side of things. But then from a legal perspective, and a lot of the reason why crypto has been able to do so well is because technology advances so much faster than the legislative or regulatory oversight that can be applied onto it. And there's no regulatory oversight in crypto. This is where the UK is actually leading the world from a legal perspective. So you talked about unexplained wealth orders, but what has now been set as precedent through the UK courts is UK courts can issue freezing orders on different crypto accounts by just having the details and going to the exchange and putting that order onto the exchange, even if they don't know who owns that particular block on the blockchain which has got so much money associated with it, and therefore no transactions, no exchange will carry out any transactions on that particular block or if there's anything that's in there, it's put in a special pool so nobody can take the funds out from it. The UK set the legal precedence in doing that from a global perspective. So it's trying to play catch up, and it's interesting to see that the courts in the UK are willing to take that, and that judges can actually understand what it is that they're doing to bring in these sorts of freezing orders.
So I'm now going to talk about, we want to move some funds. We want to move them from China to our friends in Venezuela. And then from Venezuela, we want to move them to Argentina. Now, the reason I bring these up is these are all BRICS members, as far as I'm aware, or will be BRICS members, depending on how much extra, shall we say, juice China doles out. My point being is that this avoids the American and, to a certain extent, the UK financial services and scrutiny and oversight. So building your own financial network, it seems to be the incentive to imagine like less scrutiny on those particular activities.
The classic is, how do the Russian oligarchs continue with their opulent lifestyles whenever most of their Western bank accounts, most of their bank accounts are frozen and they can't move their money around? So how do they move that wealth around? Well, they're buying valuable assets. That's why the Russians are heavily involved in Africa, and they are import-export hardwood, diamonds, gold, oil transactions that are around the place, because whenever it comes then into fossil fuels and other bits and pieces, there's possibly a little bit less due diligence done on it. A classic example of that is the world is under sanctions for Russian oil exports.
Yeah, I was going to say oil laundering.
Yeah,
that's a thing.
Certain countries, like India, will still buy Russian oil. They then take that Russian oil in, they will refine it. The UK is not allowed to buy any Russian oil, but they can buy the refined product from India. So they get the diesel and petrol from there. So this is where there's always ways around it, and the criminal organisations, because there's so much money involved, can find the ways around it quicker than law enforcement and international regulation, and international organisations can plug those gaps.
I think there's an interesting point here that's probably a little controversial, but I'm going to go for it.
Go for it.
So you'll probably remember back in the sort of Sierra Leone conflict days, one of the things that they believed was driving that conflict was the sale of diamonds, right?
Blood diamonds, yes.
It had an awful lot of diamond wealth. The neighbouring country, which I think is Liberia, had no diamond mines to speak of. Yet, all of a sudden, when international organisations said no one can buy Sierra Leone diamonds, Liberia suddenly found a load
Their
of diamonds.
diamond industry just took off.
And what they would do,
completely coincidental.
they have nomadic farmers that cross the border, right?
Yeah.
And they'd cut open the goats' back of the neck and they'd put diamonds in them, send them across in Liberia, they take them out, ship them out, someone in the Liberian bureaucracy stamps to say, it's come from Liberia, whatever.
Who's probably getting...
It's a Liberian goat, yes.
Yeah.
That goes then to, I don't know, diamond sorting in Antwerp or wherever, and then so on and so forth. But the crucial thing here is that the diamond companies in that case fully knew and were aware that at the very least this was really odd and suspicious, and at the very most this was clearly laundering diamonds through across this border.
And there is another sub-point to this, is because it was the diamond industry, I don't think anyone has really faced prosecution for this.
No.
At all.
No. And that's my point though. My point is that with all of this stuff, there are the people who are doing the crimes or doing whatever, then there's the people who are complicit and facilitating it, i.e. setting up shell companies, blah, blah, blah. And then there are the companies that are turning a blind eye, who blatantly know this is going on, but going, it's fine because on paper it doesn't look like we've got evidence of that, so that's fine. And that's the problem that you have. And what you end up doing is focusing just on the criminal element here that's using it, but the whole rest of the system that's actually facilitating
that's enabling it,
isn't being touched.
Yeah. And then it's like, where did all that hardwood come from?
Exactly.
Right? And it was a clear-cut forest that was also sold as a carbon sink by a different, unethical company.
Oh, you don't, money laundering and carbon sink and carbon credits and all the rest of it. Oh, we keep inventing these new methods and mechanisms to launder money. And this is part of the problem when it comes to all the inverted commas regulatory or green regulatory stuff that's coming around the world. You're helping criminality in so many different areas, and it's not being thought through because those individuals are looking at things from an altruistic perspective, not a wider piece. They're not bringing in the other international organizations. It's shocking. And the criminals can say so far ahead because there's a lot of money involved.
It was interesting because COVID really started this problem in my mind and accelerated it. So I'll give you an example. During COVID was used as a convenient excuse for organizations to no longer take cash because, I could get the dreaded COVID from a cash dollar bill, but if I tap and go. Now it's almost suspicious to find a business that's cash only,
Yeah.
right? Because you're thinking, well, are they avoiding tax? Are they
100%.
part of the money
100%,
laundering thing?
yeah.
Because traditionally, when we go
And
way
they're doing
back,
both, yes.
yeah, and they're doing both. Yeah, exactly. And 100% there. We know you're guilty. We're not sure what you're guilty of yet, but we'll find it.
Yeah.
But this is like 0.001% of investigative capabilities multiplied by the number of countries involved, multiplied by the number of it seems almost overwhelming for law enforcement, even when you have the resources of the United States government, and who has recently taken down a number of money laundering organizations. Let's talk about some of the innocent victims of this, though. I'm talking about folks that knowingly, or maybe not knowingly, but they get involved in a money muling scam that's made to look like it's an investment that is making a return, which then there's more of an investment that makes a return. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, also, I think typically it used to be students back in the day, didn't it?
Yeah.
They used to
Yeah.
offer students some nominal amount of money in order to basically borrow their bank account for a little while and stuff like that. And I guess also, when, you were talking to this a minute ago, but if you're looking at countries where there is severe poverty, and there's, lots, unfortunately, of those around the world, very few opportunities, and you're asking, and someone is doing something that seemingly allows them to put food on their table, like you said, it's quite a difficult thing to police and stop to then turn around and say
Definitely.
no. One of the things that I think sort of links into this, the BBC yesterday did a report on sextortion and Nigerian crime gangs.
I saw that. Yeah.
And they were talking about the struggle the Nigerian police have had to try and get control over these scammers and fraudsters that are based in Nigeria. And the Nigerian police's attitude is just basically to be rounding up large quantities of men with, I would argue, slightly flexible processes.
Instead of fighting males, they're calling them call center males.
Yeah. And they're sort of going pretty heavy-handed on it, as you can imagine. But the problem with that is, in my opinion, is to solve that problem, you have to solve the problem of poverty.
Yeah.
Because if you don't, you're fighting a losing battle. And it's the same thing with these money mule people and people who get brought into these schemes. It's people who are at a point in their life where they're feeling hopeless. They desperately need some money. At that level, you're not talking really about greed. You are talking usually about desperation. And it's exploited by the criminal gangs, by the oligarchs, by people who are trying to launder money, the terrorist groups, whatever, because they know that you're vulnerable. And that's the tragedy of this entire thing, really.
Yeah.
It's the vulnerable people who are the victims across the board.
Who get exploited, and we see that vulnerable people are exploited across the board to be brought into terrorism, brought into crime with the drug mules and elsewhere. And building on what you said, I did an investigation with the BBC in Kent in the UK a couple of years ago, where we were looking at Craigslist. And as I was going through illegal activities that were being advertised on Craigslist, one of the things that I came across were adverts for students to lend people their bank accounts. Do this and you'll instantly get an extra 20 quid. Do that, you'll get an extra 100 quid. And for poor students or other individuals that are there, it's very tempting.
Yes.
And they get the money.
So what's interesting, and you bring up a really good point, because that money piece of this facilitates all kinds of other fraud. And I'll give you a great example. In some countries, not that Lisa and I have an emergency list put together of these countries, you can quickly buy citizenship for an investment of 250,000 or 200 grand, or even 100 grand, I think. So
there are cheaper countries, but that's my list.
Phil will be
We need to collab.
a loan shark here and say, Ian, I will lend you the 100K and you can pay it back after 3 or 4 years of doing things for me. Once you land in that country, right, and you get your immigration citizenship, that's great news. My cousin's going to come and you're going to employ them in your store so I can have eyes on you, right? But yeah, I mean, you can purchase the money you need to get into a country, set up your life there, and then be beholden to an organized crime oligarch or whatnot, for an indefinite or definite period of time, depending on what deal you can take. And so what's interesting is the money, the illicit money that was used to kind of purchase your services, right? There's nothing illegal about that. I can lend you money, we can have an agreement between the two of us. It then facilitates a ton of different frauds going on, right? And I think this is the other thing is that what did the police do? They arrest that person.
Yeah.
Right? They don't go all the way up the chain because it might be too difficult. It might be blah blah blah. Now there's been some recent legislation and view on the human trafficking and the victims of human trafficking and their entitlement to compensation for that experience. It's slowly working your way through. But in the most vulnerable countries, there is not a victims relief fund, right? There is not that kind of support, and it was brought to light with the pig butchering scandal in China. Do you want to talk a little bit about the pig butchering where they? You
remember when you were butchering pigs in China?
Okay. So here's how the scam works. Basically, I'm a scammer and I'm calling people and I'm convincing them to essentially give me money for investment purposes or whatever. We're targeting affluent individuals. We're targeting, CEOs of companies, CFOs. Here's the problem. That's not illegal, really, because it would be viewed as you just gave me a gift.
Yeah.
And you say, no, you just ripped me off. And I say, well, I thought it was a gift. And you said that it was a ripoff. And, it's he said, she said. And the police go, I've got no evidence of the intent, right? So they're running this huge, huge scam. And what happened here is they had recruited people from other Asian countries and essentially gave them KPIs and targets that they must meet or they were beaten up and they were essentially incarcerated. And it's that whole exploit, kind of ecosystem that we just talked about.
But this is where what's exploited around the world is the fact that there's different rules and regulations and everything else. Even within the EU, when the UK was part of the EU, I was doing some business down into a Middle Eastern country, and the individuals in that Middle Eastern country turned around and suggested that there was an additional fee that would go to them for a contract to be let, and under UK fraud regulation, there's no way could we even continue
that idea.
Continue the conversation. So I had to walk away from it. But another EU country, under exactly the same regulations, came in and went, okay, we can't deal with you directly, but there is our representative in country who's now just set up a company in country, so we're going to transact with them at that slightly higher price with the extra 10% in it, and let them transact with you, so that the goods come from us through them, and there's ways around it. And you look at, we describe fraudulent activity in Africa, but if you talk to business people in Africa, they say, no, it's just a normal part of the way we do business. You're making sure that
culturally,
we smooth things that way. A little bit is paid there. Some has to go into the local community fund that's here, and the price of the goods is that. And
this local community.
And this is where, what we're trying to do on a global basis is apply our Western values and Western rules and legislation to what's going on, and the criminal gangs then just move into areas where that doesn't apply.
So we're gonna kind of wrap this up. So some thoughts on high-speed money laundering.
I think it's something that will never go away. I think it's something that underpins pretty much all criminality now as well, and not just criminality. If you're looking at like campaign funding for political parties, and you can't trace that, bit of a problem, right? It definitely flags some big important questions. But it comes into everything, and I think money, instead of using money laundering, because I think that's quite specific to certain things, we've talked really about money hiding today, right? More generally, but disassociating yourself from funds. And that's clearly attractive to a number of people, both legitimate and illegitimate reasons. And I think it's a massive issue. I definitely think it's a massive issue. We haven't got an awful lot better at it, I wouldn't say.
I have a big question that I want to send out to you. Is AI and machine learning going to help or even prevent this from happening? Thoughts?
This week has not been a good week for AI and machine learning.
It will be used and exploited, and I think the criminals will use it and exploit it faster than law enforcement can use it and exploit it to
like VCR
catch the
tapes.
criminals. and on the regular money laundering, my top tip is make sure you choose your detergent very carefully, because you don't want the ink to dissolve, and above 4,000 spin whenever you're drying it out. At the end of the day, the paper can start to disintegrate, so just be careful.
Yeah, I use a lot of the interns to iron out the bills as well after they come out of the laundry. Well, that's been our look at international high-speed money laundering with a geopolitical element and, of course, the cyber element. Thanks for joining us. We look forward to seeing you soon, and please subscribe.